For today's event, I am super excited and joined by some of my colleagues. First, Tim Robustelli. He is a policy analyst at Future of Land and Housing Program at New America. That is a think tank and civic innovation platform. I'm also joined by Nathan Poland, an innovation fellow at Rockefeller Foundation. Nathan is an expert at the intersection between technology and impact, and also joined by Emily Yelverton, a data scientist at DataKind and the principal technical lead for this project. So she has lots of expertise, who has worked on this project, and she, for worth mentioning, is a former DataKind volunteer for many years. Now, my name is Ben Kinsella. I'm also a project manager for DataKind, also a former DataKind volunteer like Emily. And so I'm super honored to be part of this conversation and guide the discussion and learn from all of the audience members today. So a bit on what we'll be doing today. We will be discussing open data and ethics. So Emily and Tim will provide a brief overview of their collaborative work, which was part of the Displaced in the Sunbelt report. This is going to be used as the case study that we'll be using and discussing today to explore the nexus of open data for good projects and those ethical considerations that really brings to bear on what we should be considering. And so after this brief introduction, we'll be having a panel discussion with Tim, Emily, and Nathan, who will be discussing both the implications of open data, but also really bring to light those policy considerations that come from this. And so to level set a little bit about who DataKind is and the work we do with America, as well as Rockefeller Foundation, DataKind, as many of you know, we help mission-driven organizations identify their data and AI opportunities. And so we recruit and work with pro bono data scientists to build their solutions. And so we're honored to work with organizations like New America, who work alongside our volunteers and really contribute their subject matter expertise to be able to build impactful projects. And so we do the work, the data science work with our volunteers and our project partners, but really later down the road in ensuring that the solutions are used and the impact is achieved, foundations like Rockefeller Foundation help us catalyze the experience and partnership at that first step and help with the expansion and implementation. And so, of course, as we're speaking in light of open data and ethics, we approach data ethics with this project process in mind. And so to give a little overview or voiceover of how we view data ethics, it is first really important to demarcate that data ethics is a cornerstone of our work and our DataKind projects, as well as with New America, as well as Rockefeller Foundation. And so really, we don't want to just focus on what happens if our project fails, but also what happens if our project succeeds. And of course, I'm sure many on the call here can name many, many examples that may consider automation leading to job loss, or maybe a tool could fall into the wrong hands. And so building in these conversations, or these hard conversations, better to say, is very important, particularly in our commitment to data ethics and the initiatives that we work on. To give some examples with DataKind, we are working on our playbook, as well as just general book clubs and conversations. Now, there's lots of different approaches that one could use in light of data ethics. Some of these include ODI's toolkit, as well as CARE's data maturity and ethics framework. Today, we'll be anchoring ourselves to the GBTE, but by no means this is the only ethical framework that one could use, and we're happy to share those links with you in the chat. So there's so many ethical considerations, and there's so many things to keep in mind when approaching a data science project, let alone one that uses open data, which we'll be anchoring ourselves to today. But really, when we think about developing those data for good projects, there are these key intervention and opportunity points across the data maturity and data science spectrum. And so if you're thinking about creating meaningful and impactful data science interventions, we'll see here there's sort of a three-prong, I'll say framework, but approach that one could consider when thinking about different outputs. So if you think about the first as observing the state of the world, so what story are we giving the information on hand, and what that information can we use in an ethical fashion to trust the foundation that we build? Of course, this might consider visualization outputs and really a just sort of solid understanding of what is in that data to begin with. But really working our way toward observing, but really to reasoning the data based on that output and our model of the world. So how do we understand the data? Can we process the data to make that change? And really here, this is embedded in an idea of considering an output like a predictive model and deriving insights that will help drive actions. But of course, the many ways that we can use data and the many ways we can reason with data should be used to catalyze and evoke change. And so catalyzing change requires acting, which brings us to our last piece that we will be considering in today's presentation, is that proposing solutions and identifying new opportunities and ensuring ongoing ethical use conversations really needs to be considered, and policy considerations and much more. And so today we're going to be showcasing these ethical considerations and action. And so as I've spoken a lot about the way we approach ethics and its entire importance, I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague, Emily, who will be taking us through this case study with New America. I will leave it to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Ben. We will be going over a case study which summarizes some work that DataKind did together with New America to try and combat housing insecurity in the United States. And that involved taking a look at several different data sets that we got from several different places, which we will be discussing at some point. And the idea was to build maps to visualize housing loss in order to give policymakers a better idea of where people are losing their homes so they can better allocate funds. So I will pass it to Tim to talk through these next two slides, and then I will take over again in just a moment.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Ben, and to DataKind as a whole for inviting me to participate in this exciting event today. You guys continue to just be great partners in all the work that we do. So I'll be providing just a little bit of context to the research and the collaboration that we did with DataKind. So Future of Land and Housing Program at New America studies housing, land, and property rights issues both in the United States and internationally. And this study focused on displacement or housing loss here in the US. And our motivation behind this was we knew broadly that millions of households lose their homes each year, but little is known about where housing loss is most acute, and some more granular information such as what neighborhoods, what cities, what counties are suffering the highest rates of loss. At the same time, we find that two primary mechanisms of housing loss, evictions from the rental side and mortgage foreclosures from the homeowner side, are typically examined and reported in silos. And we wanted to take a more holistic approach and really understand displacements systemically, looking at it from total view of the real estate market. And so how does this fit into our current context amid the COVID-19 pandemic? So we know from our research that housing loss persistently affects the same communities in the United States. So by understanding recent trends on where housing loss has been the most acute, we can better predict who will be hardest hit by COVID-related housing loss when the expanded social safety net, the eviction moratorium, forbearance on foreclosures expires, whenever that may be. And we think this uptick can be pretty significant based on recent data. A third of surveyed Americans, according to the US Census Bureau, say that an eviction or a foreclosure is likely or very likely in the next 2 months, and pair that with about a quarter to a fifth of US households still expecting a loss of income due to the economic downturn related to the pandemic. And there is a prediction by many housing advocates of a tsunami of housing loss in the coming months or years. Next slide, please. So I'll just quickly touch on the report that Emily and Ben both referenced. It was called Displaced in the Sun Belt. And what we did basically was we mapped and analyzed evictions and foreclosures across 7 US counties in the southern United States, or the Sun Belt region. And this included counties with large metro areas, including Maricopa County, Arizona with Phoenix, Harris County, Texas with Houston, and also some smaller counties such as Forsyth County, North Carolina, home to Winston-Salem, a city of about 350,000 people. And so we looked at data from 2017 to 2019, so right before the pandemic, to provide us a bit of a baseline of what will be happening now and into the future. And we pulled individual records when it came to evictions and foreclosures, but we visualized and aggregated them at the census tract level to really get a neighborhood view of what was happening when it came to displacement. Beyond our quantitative analysis, we sort of paired that work with the key stakeholder interviews to really contextualize the numbers and get an understanding of what was happening a bit in real time. And again, we did this because understanding where displacement has been most acute and who has been most impacted can help us better predict COVID-related housing loss and develop more targeted interventions and policy solutions. And with that, I'll pass it back to Emily to talk a bit more in depth about the data.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that voiceover, Tim. So the first thing I would like to point out here is that in the framework that we just discussed, the first thing you need to do in order to produce an ethical data science project is just observe the world around you. What data do you have available? Who is it taking into account and who is it not taking into account? And only when you have understood all the answers to all of these questions can you really move forward and build forth an ethical solution. So this map came out of our very first phase of research, in which we had county level data pertaining to evictions and foreclosures. And the first thing that you will see here is that data just wasn't available for every single county in the United States. So you see the green areas point to where we had both eviction and foreclosure data that corresponded to about 2/3 of the counties in the United States. The pink counties represents where we only had foreclosure data, and in other counties we only had eviction data. So trying to keep in mind this balance of where we had data and where we didn't set us up for the solution that we build. And also wanted to point out that data was not available everywhere. So looking at the Dakotas up there in the northern part of the map, right away, you can tell that these are people that we cannot include in our analysis right away. So we need to figure out down the line how to come back and rope them in using other means so that they're not excluded from the outputs. Another thing to keep in mind with the ethical framework is just, in terms of open data, what data is actually available. So we got housing loss data from many different sources, most often individual county clerks. And then it was in a lot of different formats. So sometimes it needed to be scanned, sometimes it was just in a flat file, and that availability, even in itself, speaks to people being included and excluded in the data. So when we look at open data like this, we really want to consider a bunch of principles from global data ethics that Ben just alluded to. So things like, how is this data collected? How is it sourced? Is there informed consent? And then for this project, we approach these questions in a few different ways. So for our socioeconomic data set, which is the census's American Community Survey, individuals opt into completing the census, meaning that they've already consented to giving their information. They've consented to the data collection and use. And as a data science team, we only see that as an aggregated level. So this aligns to the ethical principles regarding consent. For housing loss, the formal eviction or mortgage process, this is a civil court filing, which is available in some form or other, depends on what county you look at, through public records. So in this case, while it is public, you're also seeing really personal information from people. In a lot of cases, you're seeing people's names, you're seeing the addresses, you are seeing, the exact dates on which, their lives could have fallen apart. So those are a lot of things that we really need to be sensitive to when we're conducting this sort of analysis. And we also want to acknowledge that because this housing loss data is from a civil court system, it also necessarily underreports housing loss. So both from short sale foreclosures, in which case the sale is agreed to before a court case even happens, or informal evictions, in which cases, landlords could just knock on someone's door, say, you haven't paid your rent for the last 3 months, you need to leave. That doesn't go through the court system, but that is an example of housing loss that still occurs, that we don't have a record of. So if you go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit more about our open data. So while we mentioned that the American Community Survey helped us to meet several of the key principles of data ethics, like I just discussed, we also want to identify that this helps us to establish the form of using data sets with clearly established provenance, which is another principle of the global data ethical framework. And while we're doing estimations at a census tract level, this has invited healthy conversation around use and principles. So principle 8 in this framework is respect relevant tensions of all stakeholders as it relates to privacy and data ownership. So trying to consider all of these principles when we're looking at the open data that we have available will once again set us up for success. If you go to the next slide, so reasoning, we have observed the world around us, we have collected data, we have thought about what we want to build in order to establish an ethical solution for this problem. And then the next step here is reason. So that is taking all the data that we have, aggregating it in a way that makes sense, and putting it on a map so that stakeholders could use the results in order to identify where people are most losing their homes. So this is just an example of something that came out of the Displaced in the Sun Belt analysis for Orange County, Florida. So you see here that, housing loss is most acute toward the center of the city. And as we saw in many, many counties, evictions were most prevalent in areas with high proportions of Black households, high proportions of non-white households, people who take public transportation to work, and foreclosures were most prevalent in census tracts with high proportions of non-white households and high proportions of Black households. Again, this is something that we saw all across the map of your speech. So we know that these things are happening everywhere, and seeing the same things all over the place tells you that even though we don't have individual demographics for individual households who lost their homes, we only have census tract level demographics. We know that by seeing this over and over again, that it's correct. So you move to the next slide, Ben. There you go. So the last part of the framework is action. So we have observed our world, we've collected data, we have processed it, and now it's time to take everything that we've learned and put it into action. So in terms of the early uptake of these results, we have had briefings with the Tempe Mayor and City Council in Arizona, and they've used the findings from this report to target rent and utility aid, and also start pro bono tenant representation in hardest hit neighborhoods, because as we saw in the course of this analysis, that plaintiffs or landlords were far more likely to have legal representation than defendants. So right off the bat there, the landlord is at an advantage in the court system. And we did something similar in Marion County, where they used preliminary findings from the analysis to target allocation of the CARES Act. So right when COVID hit, we were able to do this. And we also have additional engagements with the evictions and foreclosure group in Central Florida, is trying to get all of this information out here and enable policymakers to use it to help people. And with that, I will pass it back to Tim to wrap up.
Thanks, Emily. I'll just make a few quick points, as I know we'd like to move on to the panel discussion, and just sort of hammer home the point that this data has ongoing applicability due to sort of problems with disbursement of housing and rental aid amid COVID-19. With the CARES Act, with the second stimulus act passed in December, and even with the act, I think passed only just a few hours ago on Capitol Hill, there is significant amount, billions and billions of dollars being allocated for rental relief and other types of housing funding. But there's been issue with disbursement, and some of the most marginalized communities across the country haven't been able to access aid in a timely manner. And in part, it speaks to organizations being stretched and trying to get the aid out to households, but it also is because a lot of most at-risk and marginalized communities simply don't know about the availability of these resources, of these funds, of legal aid. And so the ability to continue to understand where housing loss is most acute allows for better targeted interventions, which is really crucial amid COVID-19, when you perhaps can't go canvassing on every door. Ben, we could just move through the rest of the slides, and I'll turn it back to you for the panel discussion.
Yes. Okay. So I'm excited for the panel discussion, knowing that we have a lot to talk about. I'll just say that we'll transition now to having a discussion with Nathan, Emily, and Tim. And so I'll kick it to Emily, actually, for my first question. You talked a little bit about the nature of open data and preliminary on some ethical consideration. Could you talk a little bit about that intersection?
Sure, yeah, I would be glad to. So, what we tried to lay out in our case study, and what we want to reiterate here, is that in order for a project like this that uses open data to be successful, you need to go into it and approach every step from within an ethical framework. So you need to ask yourself in advance, during that observe stage, questions like, who does this data represent? Who does this data not represent? And then when you're in that reason stage, you need to ask yourself, am I being thoughtful with the story that I'm telling with this data? Am I protecting the privacy of those involved? Because as I alluded to in the presentation, a lot of the time we had individual names, individual addresses for people who are losing their homes. These are people who, through this data, we are seeing a representation of them on what could be the worst day of their life, and we need to be respectful of that. And then a lot of the times, we just needed to figure out how best to display the results of these analyses that, it conveyed the populations that needed help while also protecting their privacy. So that was a balance that we were always thinking about when we were developing these solutions.
Yeah, those are great points. And Tim, I know you have expertise in this area, and particularly the work you've done throughout and the additional project. What types of assumptions do you think these data made? So I know Emily touched briefly on the representativeness and target population, but yeah, would love if you could talk a little bit more on that.
Yeah, of course. I think the important thing to keep in mind here, and Emily alluded to this in the presentation, is that this data is not comprehensive. It's not complete. It's not capturing every incidence of housing loss in our case study locations. So you can't go into this research and you can't go into communicating about it with stakeholders in the space with the idea that this is, an end all for analysis. There are formal instances of displacement that target our most vulnerable members of society. And we have to be mindful that this data and any resulting policy solutions and allocation of resources aren't capturing those people. And those are the people that perhaps need it most. So at the start of this process, the assumption was that, we're going to try and map and analyze everything. We're going to have a comprehensive view of housing loss in the United States, but it's very important to acknowledge that that's far from the case.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear from all three of you, but I'm thinking of Nathan right now and your expertise in this area. But a lot of formal definitions have been posed, particularly on the premise of doing no harm. Do you think this project, or how might this project sort of evoke us or allow us to expand these conceptions a little bit of ethics and really take into account these social inequities that have been longstanding? I'm having a hard time hearing you, Nathan. I'm not sure.
Is that a little bit better?
Yep, all good.
Great, thank you. I was just going to say thank you, though, for inviting me to the event and doing the amazing work that you all have done with New America. It's really been amazing to watch and also to be a part of. And then to your question about the do not harm principle and really the opportunity that this project and others pose for really data science for social impact, I think from the Rockefeller Foundation's perspective, these data and projects like it offer an opportunity not just to do no harm, but also to do as much good as possible, given the openness and the transparency of the data available. And that when we use rigorous data science methods, when we use an informed understanding of what is happening in these communities with qualitative assessments and interviews like New America and DataKind did, we really have a chance to deliver serious benefit to folks in those communities through things like allowing decision makers and policymakers to use tools based on these insights for things like allocating CARES funding, allocating legal assistance for communities that need it most, exposing these already open data through visualizations and forms that allow policymakers and decision makers to use them is really contributing to how we can combat these sort of pernicious systemic issues within the communities as well. So from our perspective, it's really about doing no harm, but also maximizing the amount of good that we can do when we have these data sets available and use the right rigorous techniques.
Yeah, that's great. Tim or Emily, do you have anything to add? I'll also point you all to a question in the chat that comes from Caitlin Augustine. She asked, do you think there is an ethical obligation to make these results transparent to policymakers?
I can take a stab at that question from Caitlin. And from our perspective, what we've seen is that this data and sort of resulting analysis is not easily accessible to decision makers in a lot of the counties across the United States. But when we've reached out to them and we've engaged with policymakers, there's been a real appetite to use these tools for targeted policy interventions. So, I think as part of our mission to increase housing security in the United States as part of a sort of housing justice ethos, that there is a strong sense that we want to share these tools responsibly with largest amount of stakeholders who can find it useful to their work.
Yeah, so that almost makes me think of questions around misuse of these tools. Emily, I know we've talked about misuse of whether it's a tool in this example or other DataKind work. What are your thoughts on potential misuse of open data? Of course, it could fall in the wrong hands. What could happen?
Yeah, that was a great question, and And I'm really glad you asked me, because as you've said, this is something that we've thought a lot about. And, as we're iterating on this process of, building maps that show on a census tract level exactly where people are losing their home and at what point in time, you can go a couple of different ways here. If you are a bad actor and you have a map in front of you that, shows year over year which census tracts and essentially which segments of the population are experiencing this really acute housing loss, you can be a developer, you can take a look at that map and you might be think, oh, wow, thanks. You just gave me a list of places where I don't want to inject capital. This area is not on an upswing. It is, like on its way out, and I don't want to invest any money here. So you're kind of, in that way, you might be like encouraging like economic downturn by not investing capital in this area. On the other hand, you might have somebody like speculators who want to come in and say, okay, a lot of homes are being foreclosed on here. This is my opportunity to come in and buy some cheap houses. I will, buy them from people who are suffering. I can add in a few upgrades here and there and then put them back on the market for 20% above what they were worth. So, there is an opportunity here to use this data for, ill uses, but I think our responsibility here is to make sure that, wherever this data is being shared, it is being shared alongside that context and being put, more than anything else, that is being put in the hands of people who will do good with it.
Yeah. So, there's almost a question of, do you have the tool and you have the data? I'll first ask Nathan, and then I'll ask Tim this. Which individuals or groups would be positively impacted by a project like this? You can speak to New America's project or also your work as well, Nathan.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you can hear me this time.
Yep.
But from our perspective, the greatest good that can come from these sort of open source tools and this open source data is, like Emily mentioned, decision makers at a local level can respond to the needs of their community at a granular level. And so the people that stand to benefit the most from these sorts of projects, at least within our thinking, are the folks whose data doesn't necessarily reach decision makers at scale anyway. It's folks whose at least narrative stories or whose stories of direct testimonials or representation at the local level don't necessarily always reach those decision makers. And we have data that does, to some extent, represent the conditions that they might be experiencing that might not otherwise be indexed or referenced. And so from our perspective, it's really about, where possible, using data that already exists to tell some of the stories of what's happening in these communities. And just as what I think is a really important note of what New America and DataKind have done is continuing to integrate the qualitative research that makes sure that the numerical data doesn't get elevated above the sort of human data, and really using the numerical data as a vehicle to transmit what is happening in these places, even to the decision makers that are right there that simply don't even necessarily know what's happening within their own communities if they don't have that map, that visual representation, and those hard numbers.
That's so great. It seems like, I've heard, or we've all discussed here in terms of the data that is captured and the assumptions that are made, but also understanding what's not captured. And, you mentioned, Nathan, about the qualitative piece of this. Tim, question for you, in terms of policy implications on, as you work with policymakers and your own work and leveraging open data, could you talk a little bit about what this understanding or this overall new conception of open data ethics, how it should inform policymaking?
Yeah, of course, I can speak a little to that, and I'll start by saying that I think Nathan hit the nail on the head with talking about this data. Going through the policy formulation process and eventually helping some of the most marginalized communities in the United States, but before it even gets there, we have policymakers who need to make those decisions, and giving them this information, giving housing advocates this information to back up what they may know to be true through anecdotes in their everyday work on the ground, giving them hard numbers to back that up and advocate for the allocation of resources, where they feel it's appropriate, I think is a very powerful thing for them to have in their back pockets. When it comes to policy formulation as a whole, I think we do need to continue to be mindful that the people who need this help the most, the policies that should be crafted to help these individuals. These are the most marginalized people in communities for the most part. And how does it reach them? What's the last mile? How do they know about these resources? So not only crafting appropriate policy, based on the data that we have, based on the data that we're sharing, but making sure that it actually reaches those who need it most.
So Mallory, who is our amazing behind the scenes person right now, she will be putting you into groups at this moment.
Yeah, and while Mallory does that, I can actually address one of the questions in the chat. Faraz asked, what did the data process look like for collecting the court system's data, and how did you go about it, and who did you contact? So this looked different for every county, because it will be different for every county, but a lot of the times we were able to directly contact county clerks of court. Some counties have data officers, who and data already available in a database that they can produce for you. So, and sometimes it was easy. In some other counties, they are not as technically advanced in terms of their collection of this data. So they might have it available in PDFs that then need to be scraped using some kind of OCR tool to get the actual information out of them. And then in some counties, that we have spoken to and will speak to, they have this data only available via paper forms that are locked away in some filing cabinet somewhere. So the process looks different for every county, and part of what we want to achieve via this project is some sort of framework like that we can recommend, so that anyone who wants to visualize this data in their own communities is able to. We really want to empower people to be able to do that.
Okay, I'm ready to send everyone to their rooms.
Perfect. Looking forward to it. So we have just a few minutes, and I believe we have a little bit of time to do a report back, but I'll keep it brief, and I know I can make some comments on my room, but would love to hear from the other individuals who guided the conversations, just a quick snippet of how your time went. And so I'll just say that observe, as we're thinking of these the importance of collecting data and the questions surrounding sort of mitigation strategies. I'll report back and say that we had a great conversation on questions over who collects the data and really to what means. And this really came up with sort of American Community Survey as well as other public data. And then in terms of gaps, of course, there's questions around bias and filling those gaps. I know Eric on our group talked about imputation strategies and knowing when to navigate that. And Leo and Emily also talked about that could be done with underrepresented communities and strategies. So this was a really great conversation, and also invite anyone else who was on the observe side.
Yeah, Ben, I'm happy to hop in here. I had a really captivating conversation with Jill Brown. I'll give Jill a shout out because we really had a really good discussion where we also talked about social psychology methods and how information gaps in that particular field are, of course, I think illustrative of a general principle when we're working with gaps in information, which is that, of course, it's inappropriate to extrapolate to a larger population from very limited data. That's, of course, important to keep in mind in any context. And I think another big takeaway for our group was being particularly attuned to culturally sensitive indicators and metrics, and knowing when a method has been proven to be applicable and proven to be reliable for that population or that sample that you're working with. So making sure that there's a fit between the method and the context that you're looking to apply it in.
Great. I'd love to hear from those who are on the reason teams. Does any of the facilitators want to contribute anything?
Sure. I know we had two different rooms, so I'll just weigh in very briefly on mine. So in terms of how open data can be misused, Phil in my room gave a really great example of, there are open data sets out there that might nominally be anonymized. So there isn't a name attached to it. There isn't an address attached to it. But, if you have a lot of tweets from someone, for example, and, there is a latitude and a longitude attached to those tweets, and you see night after night, 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, you see tweets happening in the same place over and over again for this one person, that's probably where that person lives. So even if directly identifiable information is not attached to some open data, bad actors can potentially come in there and back into the private information that was originally stripped out. So just having to be mindful of that, throughout throughout the process.
Great. What about the act, right? We want to catalyze change and really take what we understand from our data and identifying these potential misuses. How does this land with those who were on these calls?
Sure, I can speak a few points to our conversation. The first was we discussed power dynamics when it came to access to data and decision making. A lot of times, private equity firms, investors, landlords will have access to housing loss data, and that informs a lot of the economic decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis. So how do we get that data, open data, everything we talked about, to decision makers that can perhaps help out marginalized communities when it comes to housing stability? We also talked at ways to get at informal data, or I should say data about informal evictions, and sort of what other data sets could be used as proxies to maybe develop a better understanding of marginalized communities experiencing informal evictions and how to develop interventions to help them out, whether that's utility shutoffs, changes of addresses, children switching schools, proxies like that. And the last point I'll make is Stacy brought this up in our group. I'll give her a shout out. And you really need to be talking to the individuals who these policies are being shaped for, really getting in the same room as those people and hearing from them and hearing what they would find most useful and most effective to their problems.
And I'll add, because we also had a breakout room happening around ACT, to say that we thought about policymakers and sort of the lack of ethics or standards maybe being prohibitive to standardized release or the opening up of data. So kind of taking the precautionary principle to the extreme, you need to prove no harm from every step of your process before you're allowed to implement your process. And we had a couple of great members speaking from their own government experience there. And then the other thing we talked about was, sometimes policymakers not being the ones who could act quickly. So what is the level of information and level of aggregation that would be ethically useful to share to, say, NGOs? So who's administering rent relief, and if it's a private entity administering that, is there a faster information flow that perhaps could happen to that organization who doesn't need to pass policy or law in order to allow action to move forward?
Yeah. I'll just say this has been such an exciting conversation, and we probably could continue on and talk about this for another hour. But hey, the conversation doesn't end here, because we actually have 2 more events coming up this week. An event, I believe it's tomorrow, with Caitlin, who just spoke. She's leading a conversation on community healthcare, as well as with project scoping on Friday with our senior manager of Center of Excellence, who will be discussing how to scope projects with open data. So there's a lot of things to continue unpacking with open data and ethics and how that intersects with doing data for good projects. But I'll just say thank you everyone on the conversation. Well, first and foremost to the panelists and the audience. So this has been a really great conversation. And I think Caitlin just put our contact in the chat, but please feel free to keep in contact, ask questions with the other panelist members as well. But with that, we will end the event here.
So thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good one.